There are moments where Detroit Become Human is everything you want it to be. When this stunningly rendered sci-fi metropolis and the slow-building arcs of its various characters finally converge, it's almost impossible not to be floored by the sheer scope of its brilliantly realised web of interweaving narratives. Taking its cues from Blade Runner, Westworld and Channel 4's Humans, Detroit puts players in the shoes of various androids as they are thrust into the midst of a mass sentient awakening. With these once-obedient machines slowly becoming awake, it is up to players to lead the android revolution or find a way to accept their programming and coexist with mankind. With your choices and pivotal moments spawning literally hundreds of different outcomes, there's an exhilarating sense of dread at play whenever you're faced with making one of Detroit's increasingly difficult decisions. The weight of these decisions are highlighted at the end of each chapter, where you are presented with a flowchart showing how many branching outcomes were born out of each choice. But it's not until you've seen the credits roll that you can go back and actually replay these key scenes. Unfortunately though, many players won't have the patience to see how their stack of carefully considered choices ends up playing out. While Quantic Dream has given players the keys to unlock a staggering amount of different branching narratives, frustratingly, that same level of freedom simply isn't afforded to players in the minute-to-minute gameplay. When the game begins, players are treated to a jaw-dropping look at the pristinely rendered city of the game's namesake. Detroit's bustling streets are illuminated by a sea of neon signs, with futuristic trains and hovering cars adorning a skyline. In other words, it's an idyllic-looking metropolis that's simply begging to be explored. Sadly though, you never really get the chance. The level of player agency in each environment feels shockingly restrictive. Like in Heavy Rain, you are largely tasked with wandering around a small environment and locating a series of objects before talking to various NPCs. Whenever you're finally dropped into the city, you can only go a few steps before being met with red out-of-bounds signs. For a game trying to tell an immersive story, it's something that completely drags you out of the experience. It would be easier to dismiss the disappointing lack of gameplay innovation if the story was largely without such issues, but it's not just the occasional lack of story choice that frustrates. When offering the player a narrative-driven experience, ultimately the whole game lives and dies on its writing and voice acting, and in this regard, Detroit is a fairly mixed bag. Thanks to some wonky writing, there are a few scene transitions that feel hugely jarring, with characters ending one scene only to appear somewhere else entirely, with very little explanation as to why they are there or how they arrived. There are, however, a few attempts at moving the gameplay forward here from what we saw in Heavy Rain, with players often tasked with solving a few basic puzzles or playing out little simulations that determine which routes the character takes in an action scene. Still though, these sections ultimately feel like an arbitrary distraction from the game's key focus, decision making. It's a shame, as games like Until Dawn have proved that you can simultaneously offer players narrative freedom and a compelling interactive experience, with the aforementioned horror game using its exploration sections to really ramp up the sense of tension. Detroit Become Human is a game that really comes into its own during the finale. While most decisions you make during this 12-hour plus journey have pretty immediately apparent outcomes, it's during Detroit's final hours where the sheer scope of Quantic Dream's choice mechanics build into a glorious, nail-biting conclusion. Ultimately though, even its breathtaking cinematic conclusion isn't enough to stop Detroit Become Human from feeling like, at best, a flawed classic and at worst, a frustratingly restrictive experience. If, however, you can endure the game's more tedious aspects and embrace the bad with the good, Detroit's branching endings will undoubtedly compel you to dive into countless chapter replays and, despite its flaws, probably spark heated conversations for years to come. Because of this, we've decided to award Detroit Become Human a fandom score of 3.5 out of 5.